Hello and welcome to everybody to this event organized by the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in Britain. My name is Bernard Regan. I'm the Secretary of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this evening's meeting. 60 years ago, the United States organized mercenaries to attack the fledgling Cuban Revolution and launched an attack at Playa Giron, which lasted over 3 days. And during those 3 days, the Cuban Revolutionary Army inflicted a defeat on those mercenaries and a defeat on the United States imperialism. So this evening's meeting is a commemoration of that event and a celebration of that success, which was extremely important. The CIA, which was behind the plot, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, said in its plan the following: the initial mission, that is the mission of the mercenaries, the initial mission of the invasion force will be to seize and defend a small area, which can be used as the site for the establishment of a provisional government, which can be recognized by the United States. The way will then be paved for the US military intervention aimed at the pacification of Cuba. So it was very clear what the objective was behind the attack. It was to defeat the Cuban Revolution. This evening's meeting, as I've said, is a commemoration and a celebration of the defeat of the United States-backed invasion of Cuba. And we have a panel of 3 guests who I'll introduce in more detail. We have the ambassador, Her Excellency Bárbara Montalvo Álvarez. We have the well-known anti-imperialist campaigner, writer, author, Tariq Ali. And we have the distinguished member of the historic generation of the Cuba, Victor Dreke, who was a leading figure at the intervention against the invading forces at Playa Giron and went on to be engaged in other extremely important political activity and intervention, including going to the Congo with Che Guevara to fight against the mercenaries who were attacking the forces of Patrice Lumumba. We'll have those 3 speakers. We'll have interspersed with some films and also with an opportunity, we hope at the end, providing we have enough time, for questions to be asked and for our panelists to come back and contribute. Some people will be watching this on Zoom, some will be watching it on YouTube. We hope if you're watching on YouTube, you'll like it and you'll share it with others so that it can be spread as widely as possible. We aim to finish the meeting by 7:45 at the latest, 7:45. So that's our schedule for the evening. I'd also like to welcome guests that we have wherever you are, whether you're in Britain or in other parts of the world, and guests that we have watching from Cuba, I believe, watching on YouTube, because unfortunately, owing to the blockade, it's not possible for Cuba to use Zoom as a platform to see meetings of this kind, and so they will be using YouTube. So a very warm welcome to comrades in Cuba. Our first guest is Victor Dreke. I met Victor Dreke in 2011 when he came to England to speak. He is, as I said, one of the members of the historic generation, the generation that made the revolution in Cuba. And he was an activist from his teenage years, from very early on. And he was involved in organizing all sorts of activities, including activity and with workers, with peasants, and so on, and played a role in the Battle of Santa Clara, which was, of course, the defining battle that took place during the course of the Cuban Revolution, when Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos defeated Batista's army and blew up the armored train which was coming to the town to provide reinforcements for Batista's failing army at the time. So Victor Dreke was a part of that and was very active in that. And he also, as I said, went on to go to Cuba, to go to the Congo, to fight in the Congo and to engage in other activity. He was a close friend of Amilcar Cabral as well, and was very engaged with African revolutionaries in their fight for national liberation against the imperialists. So we're going to watch a part of a film. We'll be showing episodes from the war itself, and then we're going to invite Victor to speak. So I'm very pleased and very honored to invite Victor Dreke to address us. Thank you.
In 1961, John Kennedy inherited the invasion plans from Eisenhower. He allowed it to go ahead, but vetoed the use of U.S. combat forces. As preliminary acts leading to the invasion, saboteurs burned thousands of acres of sugarcane, and the La Cubre, a Belgian freighter carrying arms, was blown up at a Havana dock. A second bomb was timed to explode as volunteers reached the burning ship to help the victims. Over 100 people were killed and hundreds more wounded. Moreover, exiled Cuban pilots flying American planes painted with Cuban insignia bombed 2 airports, killing a number of civilians. Again, Fidel called on the Cuban people. On April 16, 1961, in a dramatic speech following the funeral of those who had been killed, he made one of the most important declarations in Cuban history.
Primero que empieza a preguntar, ¿están de acuerdo con la reforma urbana? Y entonces los de adelante se ven todos levantando el rifle y todo el pueblo atrás, ¿no? Entonces sí, todo el mundo levanta. ¿Están de acuerdo con la reforma urbana? ¿Están de acuerdo con la reforma de la enseñanza? ¿Están de acuerdo, bueno, con toda la revolución que se ha hecho en la enseñanza, en la salud? Sí, sí, sí. Entonces dice, esto que hemos hecho se llama socialismo.
Y que esa revolución socialista la defendemos con esos fusiles.
Fidel dirigió personalmente las operaciones y rechazaba la petición de nosotros que se pusiera a un mayor resguardo, a una mayor distancia del frente de combate.
The Bay of Pigs invasion, which was launched from Nicaragua, ended in disaster. The forces directed by the United States met with intense, unexpected Cuban resistance, and the battle ended in 72 hours. The captured Cuban exiles were later exchanged for baby food and medicine. In the mountainous regions, opposition groups financed by the CIA formed pockets of resistance against the revolution, but they were eventually overcome. The overt
We hope now to hear from Victor.
Buenos días, yo soy Romila, yo soy el director del campaña de solidaridad con Cuba aquí en el Reino Unido. Es un honor, es un privilegio para hacer esta entrevista con el coronel de las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, señor Víctor Dreke. Estás con nosotros. Bueno, Víctor, cuéntenos un poco sobre usted y su vida antes y después de la Revolución Cubana.
Bueno, no es muy fácil. Buenos días y muchas gracias por su amabilidad de poder hablar con usted y ese país, pueblo que también admiramos. Bueno, yo nací en un lugar que se llama Sabana Grande, en la provincia de Las Villas, un pueblo pequeño, pero que en aquella época era uno de los pueblos que tenía más posibilidades desde el punto de vista económico por tener en su área 9 centrales azucareras, que era la fuerza mayor que había en Cuba en aquella época. Y era un país, un pueblo, refiriendo a mi país, a mi pueblo donde nací, de muchas perspectivas, pero que los pobres no teníamos perspectivas ninguna. Los pobres lo que tenemos la perspectiva de pasar trabajo, pasar hambre, la discriminación de todo tipo, no solamente racial, sino la discriminación de todo tipo a la mujer, al hombre, fuese blanco o fuese mestizo, y si era negro, peor. Pero ya habían empezado el mismo triunfo de la revolución las bandas contrarrevolucionarias. ¿Qué fueron las bandas contrarrevolucionarias? Individuos que el imperialismo compró para enfrentarlo a la revolución. Y dolorosamente algunas de esas personas que se enfrentaron a la revolución eran gente pobre, del Escambray, de la Sierra Maestra, de las montañas, que nunca habían tenido patria prácticamente, eran siempre explotados por los reyes. Entonces, bueno, unieron, lo engañaron y algunos se unieron y se formó la batalla entre la revolución y ellos. Vinieron los sabotajes que usted conoce, el Encanto, que fue volado, una tienda grande nuestra, falleciendo una compañera, vino la Cubre, donde murieron casi todos los marinos nuestros y algunos marinos franceses que estaban ahí, murieron también en el vapor La Cubre. Y el día 15, muy lejos, de abril, ayer casualmente se cumplió un aniversario más, descargaron sus bombas sobre nuestros aeropuertos. Dos de nuestros aeropuertos ahí descargaron las bombas los aviones que tenían las letras de la FARC de Cuba, pero realmente eran aviones de Estados Unidos, que le había dado los B-26, que también teníamos nosotros, pero que los tres B-26 se habían dado a los mercenarios que estaban en Guatemala y Nicaragua preparando. Ahí atacaron. Y entonces se fue el día 15. Hay un hecho histórico, además de eso, que entre los compañeros que cayeron, hay un compañero que cuando cae herido, ya de muerte, tiene al lado un pedazo de tabla. No sé si saben de lo que es tabla. Pedazo de tabla de madera. Se pasa la mano por la herida y pone aquel pedazo de madera Fidel. Eso para nosotros los cubanos no se nos olvida. Ni para los cubanos de mi época, ni para los cubanos que vienen después. Eso no se nos olvida. Y ya, al amanecer del 17 comienza el ataque a Playa Giron. Ahora, ¿qué hice yo? Yo en aquel momento estaba en Sabana Grande. Había terminado de formar la escuela de milicia de Atillo, un lugar en la provincia de Atillo. Una primera escuela de milicia que la fundó nuestro comandante en jefe. Fue la primera escuela de milicia que fundó el comandante Fidel. Por allá por la zona de Nicaragua, y se hizo una segunda escuela en Atillo, ya en la provincia de Las Villas, para acá, hacia el norte, donde había un grupo de compañeros estudiantes. Inclusive habían compañeros de unidades de La Habana que estaban estudiando ahí, preparándose como milicianos. Era la preparación de los milicianos, de todo el pueblo. Bueno, allí yo había terminado esa escuela, y precisamente ese día 17 de diciembre, como a las 8 de la mañana, llego a la dirección del ejército en Santa Clara, que era el antiguo escuadrón, no me recuerdo el número del escuadrón, que era donde estaba la jefatura en aquel momento. Llego allí, acompañado con mi chofer, Jairo Miranda, que íbamos rumbo a Oriente. Yo pedí el traslado para Santiago de Cuba, para la Merced, iba para el canal de la Merced. Y cuando entramos allá a la puerta aquella, vemos el trajín de la gente corriendo, el arma, no sé qué, de invasión. ¿Cómo es invasión? ¿Qué pasó? Le pregunto a los compañeros. Y hay uno de los compañeros que me explica así, la invasión, los americanos desembarcaron. Era la primera noticia que llegó a Cuba y que llegó al pueblo. Los americanos desembarcaron, porque había habido puesto atentado, y el atentado del día 15, que fue el preludio de la invasión. Entonces, ¿qué voy a hacer yo? Imagínate tú, estoy en Cuaresma, ¿no? Tú sabes, no sé si estoy en Cuaresma, estoy que me voy para Oriente. No voy para Oriente, compadre. No. Quizá ahora 90 años me voy para Oriente, pero en aquel momento ni ahora tampoco voy para Oriente. Voy para Girón, a donde desembarcaron los tipos Le dije, chofer, arranca a Girón. Yo nunca he ido a Playa Giron. No conocía aquello. Y entramos a Playa Giron por Bárbara. Fue una instalación aquello que pasó por ahí. Me dicen, fue un libro hecho por algunos compañeros. Allí estábamos, en puesto de mando, el compañero comandante Raúl Menéndez Torma Sevilla, el compañero comandante René Los Santos y otros compañeros altos oficiales de nuestras Fuerzas Armadas. En aquel momento estaban ahí. Yo no los vi, yo no me paré, seguí, hasta que choqué con los mercenarios. Choco con varios compañeros nuestros ya milicianos y algunos del batallón, una compañía del batallón 117 y otra compañía del batallón 113, que algunos de ellos se habían preparado en Atillo, donde yo había estado, que me conocían de Atillo como jefe de la preparación de aquellos milicianos y me conocían de la escambray en la lucha contra bandidos en los primeros momentos, que todavía no estaba creado el LCD. Bien una historia. A la gente se le olvida la historia y dicen cositas que no saben. No estaba creado, pero había un grupo que luchaba contra bandidos y en el cual estuvo personalmente el comandante en jefe y los principales comandantes y capitanes del ejército roberto. Fue muy importante para Cuba y para América, porque Cuba ratificó una vez más que sabía defenderse, ratificó una vez más que esto no lo iban a tomar nadie, que había que acabar con el pueblo de Cuba para tomar Cuba. Y sirvió para América, para que América supiera que los americanos no eran invencibles, que a los americanos se podía vencer con la moral, la dignidad de los pueblos, porque en aquel momento no teníamos las armas que tuvimos después. En aquel momento teníamos armas, pero no las que tuvimos después. Entonces eso fue un significado para Cuba, para América y para la vergüenza de los pueblos dignos de América Latina y de todo el mundo. Pero bueno, ¿qué pasa en este momento? Que a pesar de la situación que tenemos, del bloqueo que tenemos, que es un bloqueo antihumano, porque están bloqueando los medicamentos, en medio de una pandemia terrible que tiene el mundo, bloquean los medicamentos a Cuba, bloquean la ayuda a Cuba, bloquean la actitud de ayuda a Venezuela, por la moral de Venezuela, por la moral de Chávez, por la moral de Maduro, por la moral de Díaz-Canel, por la moral de este pueblo, por la continuidad histórica de este pueblo, ya no de nosotros, de los 80 y tal, de los que vienen, de los que están, que van a ser aún mejor que nosotros. Ya no serán, ojalá que no sean nunca los combates, pero ahora mismo los medios de difusión en el mundo tienen que defender a la revolución cubana. Y nosotros y ustedes tienen que ser capaces de entrar a los medios de difusión del mundo para que se sepa la verdad de la revolución cubana. Ese es el combate que tenemos ahora. ¿No? Ese es el combate que es para debilitar el pueblo, para ablandar el pueblo y para intentar tomar el pueblo otra vez. Ellos han cambiado la táctica, nosotros estamos listos, ojalá que no pase, pero podemos también decirle a los amigos de América y del mundo que Cuba, la de Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Juan Almeida, la de Che Guevara, esa Cuba no fallará jamás, ni con nosotros, ni con lo que venga después. Patria, muerte, y venceremos, y seguiremos venciendo. Esta es continuidad. Lo más destacado fue todo lo que pudimos ver allí. Que cuando tú no conoces a un pueblo, no conoces a un país, aunque te hablen, es bueno, es malo, es regular, tú dices, coño, ¿cómo será? Cuando tú llegas a ver el cariño de un grupo grande de amigos, eso no se puede olvidar. Allá lo que olvidan eso, ¿no? El cariño de la gente. Que muchas personas, sin conocer realmente la situación que había pasado en Cuba, se unían a través de ustedes y otros organismos, se unían a nosotros, a la revolución, a la defensa de Fidel Castro, a la defensa de la revolución. Eso no se nos puede olvidar a nosotros. Y sabemos, y por eso el Instituto de Amistad con los Pueblos les agradece a ustedes, los quiere a ustedes, como queremos a todos los amigos de Cuba, que en momentos difíciles, cuando todo el mundo no era amigo de Cuba, dijeron presente con Cuba. Pero Cuba ha demostrado también que ha puesto su vida, su sangre, sus médicos, lo que tenemos y lo que no tenemos, para no ayudar Eso no nos ayuda, sino es para cumplir con el compromiso que tenemos con la revolución, para cumplir no solo con el compromiso con África, sino con todos los países que han luchado por Cuba. Ese es un compromiso de la revolución cubana. Y este viejito de 84 años está hablando con nosotros. No, hablo por mí y hablo por los míos. Los míos no es mi hijo, ni mi nieta, ni mi mujer. Los míos son los cubanos. Los míos son los que quieren a Cuba. Esos son los míos y por eso hablo. Mientras que puedo hablar luego por eso. Y ojalá que no tengamos más que empuñar el fusil para defender esos criterios, esas valoraciones que hace nuestro comandante jefe y que hace el hoy presidente, compañero Díaz-Canel, al cual le debemos aprecio, cariño y respeto. Esa es la continuidad de nuestra revolución. ¡Viva Cuba Libre!, como dice Raúl Castro.
Bueno, Víctor, ya terminaste la entrevista. Bueno, gracias para todos tu atención, tu entrevista aquí. Es un honor para tu tiempo. Contigo siempre, compañero.
Thank you very much to Victor Dreke and to the comrades in Cuba. Our greetings, our solidarity, and our pledge of continuing support for the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people in opposing the illegal and immoral blockade conducted by the United States of America, and be assured that we will continue to work in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. For those of you who perhaps have heard Victor for the first time, I'd just like to say that there are books available from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, and we will put the links to the page on the website where you can obtain those books, including Victor's own account of his participation in the Battle of Playa Giron, but also not only in his role in Cuba, but in the Congo as well, which is a fascinating account of the solidarity given by Cuba to the peoples of Africa, of course, which was also repeated in the support that they gave to the people of Angola in resisting the attacks of the South African army. And as Nelson Mandela said, led, of course, to the defeat of apartheid in South Africa by that act of solidarity which they participated in. And their solidarity was not just by carrying arms, but as we've seen over the last decades, by their incredible contribution in the medical field of going in self-sacrificing way to help people fighting Ebola and also to help people fighting against the pandemic. So if you want to hear more of Victor Dreke's story, I suggest you have a look at the links that we'll put up and have a look at that book, which I think is a fascinating account. I have to own up to being very proud of owning a copy of that, actually signed by Victor himself. So it's one of my very precious possessions. I want to now invite our next speaker to address you. I'm very pleased to welcome the ambassador to talk of her reflections on the events of the Bay of Pigs and its significance for Cuba, and why it's important to Cuba today. Her Excellency, Ambassador Bárbara Montalvo Álvarez. Welcome, Bárbara.
Thank you. I thank the Cuba Solidarity Campaign for organizing this meeting to commemorate one of the most relevant events in the history of the Cuban Revolution. And I am especially thankful for the participation of comrades Victor Dreke and Tariq Ali. I was 11 when Girón took place. I lived in a town near the capital. My father and my older brother, who was 15, were militiamen. They had mobilized, waiting near the center of operations, but did not go into combat. Fathers and young men, even adolescents, were also away from home, mobilized. The main road that crossed the island passed right in front of our neighborhood, and we constantly saw the passing of trucks full of militiamen. People came out to greet them, hoping to identify some of their relative among them. I was lucky because mine returned to home, but a gunner who had not turned 15, the youngest of the Girón fighters, was mortally wounded and died shortly after arriving at the nearest hospital. His name was Nelson Fernandez Esteves. He was the only brother of one of my classmates, Miriam. As soon as possible, my father took us to the scene, an endless straight road, depopulated on both sides until we reached Girón. Ciénaga de Zapata was one of the poorest and most abandoned areas in the country. It was one of the first places where the social works of the revolution began. The new houses that have been given to the peasants were partially destroyed by bombings and the impacts of bullets. The shelters were spontaneous guides who used to remember their memories. The most important of all, the arrival of Fidel in a tank heading the troop. On the beach, the adults pointing out to sea and talking about the American ships we sank. But those images only had a real meaning for me when I became an adult. Girón was much more than the first great military defeat of the United States in America. The fate of the newly born Cuban Revolution was decided in Girón. Had the enemy plans been successful, the story would have been different for Cuba and also for Latin America. Those who fought and died then did so for socialism. Members of the rebel army, the emerging National Revolutionary Police, and the militias fought under a single command. They were the embryo of our revolutionary armed forces and a defense strategy in which all the people involves. Mercenaries did not suffer cruelty or repression. They were returned to the United States, exchanged for food and medicines for population already suffering the effects of harassment from the USA. Nobody welcomed them. They were received with a cry of homeland or death, and in less than 72 hours, they were defeated. In Girón, we learned not to be afraid of the enemy, no matter how powerful. And that event not only made us stronger internally, but also contributed to gaining respect and solidarity all over the world. Our enemies learned that in Cuba, homeland or death is not a slogan, but a meaning of life. Another army, the literacy campaign, was there, and at the end of 1961, it was successful too. 60 years later, Ciénaga de Zapata, which in 1958 had the highest infant mortality rate in the entire country, has today 0 infant and maternal mortality. In its rugged geography, 12 surgeries were built with 487 health professionals providing services in minor surgery, pediatrics, obstetrics, and gynecology, internal medicine, X-rays, and Summa. 60 years later, Girón's legacy remains inspiring for us. Recalling these events encouraged those born many years later who have the responsibility of never stopping in a long, dangerous, and difficult path like the one the heroic fighters of Girón traveled back then, leading to victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bárbara, for that contribution. I think it's certainly important that we all recognize that Cuba continues to play a leading role throughout the world, and an inspiring role, in my view, which we should all support. And that's despite the fact that Cuba faces one of the worst blockades that any country in the world has ever faced for more than 60 years. From the very beginning of the revolution, the United States of America has intervened to place a blockade on Cuba's ability to trade. And that has been ratcheted up during the 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. Something like 240 new measures have been added to the ones which were imposed with the Helms-Burton Act and the Torricelli Act of the 1990s, cutting off Cuba's ability to have access to banks and to other financial houses and so on, through which it could conduct trade. And that blockade continues. So I hope that all of you who are on this Zoom will consider, if you are not already members of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, I hope you will join the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. I think it's an extremely important campaign, and one which is already widely supported by more than 24 national trade unions and by countless trade union branches, and also by many individuals. But there is still a need to build that support, even though people perhaps hoped that with the election of Joe Biden, we might have seen some amelioration of the worst aspects of the way in which the blockade is conducted. There has to date been no change. And I think it's important to say that although some people thought that Barack Obama might bring in changes which would end the viciousness of that blockade, in fact, of course, he didn't. He just changed some of the superficial characteristics of it, but in essence, wanted to continue with that same offensive against Cuba that Bárbara talked about and that Victor talked about, that we see daily in the media, of misrepresenting the real truth about Cuba and the role that Cuba has played. So if you're not a member of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, I hope you'll consider joining. What I would also ask you to do is to have a look at the Cuba Solidarity Campaign website. We have on there an early day motion, which we're asking you to contact your members of parliament and ask them to sign. We've already had 43 members of parliament who've signed that. And it's a way of indicating to the government that we want to see a change of attitude by Britain, so that Britain itself is not complicit in the blockade that Cuba is facing, and that Britain breaks with those kind of attitudes. So I hope that you will just take it. Will only take you 30 seconds maybe to look on the website, to check that link, and to send off a message to your member of parliament. I just want to let you know, by the way, in terms of this evening's meeting, we've had people, as I said, watching from all across Britain, but also from other parts of the world, including Berlin, Tamil Nadu, South Africa, New York, and other places as well. So to all of those people as well, a very warm welcome to you, as to everybody else who's online here. We're going to see, before I concluding speaker of this section, a short clip of Che making a speech reflecting on the Playa Giron and the events that took place there. It's a very short clip, but I'm sure you will appreciate why it's important to show it on this occasion. Thank you.
Playa Giron es un símbolo para todos los pueblos oprimidos. Playa Giron es la primera derrota del imperialismo en América Latina, pero también es una de las primeras derrotas del imperialismo en escala mundial. Así hemos llegado a este año 61, donde no estamos ni remotamente solos, y avanzamos así tan rápidamente como ustedes saben, hasta poder proclamar el 1 de mayo a esta revolución como la primera revolución socialista de América.
Thank you. Just to say, as a reminder, by the way, for people who want details about the early day motion, about joining Cuba Solidarity Campaign, you will find that listed in the chat. So please have a look there and copy that and use it to follow up on the requests that we're making. Our concluding speaker of this section is someone who has been a consistent anti-imperialist campaigner in this country, a leading member of the Stop the War campaign, and before that, a member of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and been an exemplary fighter against American imperialism and British imperialism, and indeed a prolific author, having written numerous books, including famously, I think it was called The Pirates of the Caribbean, and also wrote the introduction to Castro, the Declaration of Havana, which we have been referencing earlier on in this evening's meeting. So I'm very pleased to introduce a long-standing comrade and friend of mine, Tariq Ali. Tariq, you need to unmute.
Very happy to be with our Cuban comrades, in particular, Victor, who has already spoken, the ambassador, who I have not met, but I hope we will soon, and to talk on this occasion. Now, if you look at it on a global scale, you will note that a year into every revolution that has taken place in the 20th century, key revolutions, imperialism intervened. A year after the Russian Revolution, 22 Western powers belonging to the Entente were just barely finished fighting the First World War. A monstrous war, bloodshed, turned their attention, joined the czarists and monarchists and antites in Russia, and attempted to topple the Russian Revolution. Almost exactly a year afterwards. A civil war that took many lives and which would have been defeated very rapidly had the West not intervened. 1 year after the revolution in China, which was in October 1949, the Americans unleashed a war in the Korean Peninsula, the aim of which, really, if the truth be told, was to push the Chinese back and to see what they could do to weaken and hopefully defeat them. And the American General MacArthur wanted to cross the Yalu River and go into China, but was stopped from doing so by Truman, who actually fired him because the logic of that would have been to use nuclear weapons. That was the only way they could have defeated China. And the third event, of course, is, as Jay expressed it, to see how they could crush a revolution on their doorstep. I mean, that is the amazing thing about Cuba. Not simply its politics, its revolutionary fervor, but where it is placed geopolitically. And it is placed basically just outside the United States. This is what worried them. They were late in reacting to it because the Cuban Revolution was not in the traditional mode of a revolution led by the traditional Communist Party or a communist movement. It was largely a nationalist revolution against American occupation, which moved leftwards, as we saw, till it was proclaimed a socialist revolution in 1960. So a decision was taken even before long before the invasion, by the Republican administration, led by under President Eisenhower, his Secretary of State Dulles, and Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, which is well known in most parts of the world as a legally accepted, but effectively an organization that imposes terror, that carries out terrorist attacks, that kills people, that tries to remove governments, etc. The CIA, for a long, long time, it was brought under some control because of its many failures, but essentially is a state-backed terrorist organization. And the Dulles brothers belong to one can only describe as a family of criminal imperialists who should have been charged with war crimes and before some independent court, which of course didn't exist. And they were very much in the mold of an aggressive foreign policy, and they were discussing early on how to topple the new government in Cuba, well before the 1960, when there was an election. And during the 1960 election campaign in the United States, both sides tried to compete with each other to see who could bring down Fidel Castro first. The rhetoric of Eisenhower and his side was no different from the rhetoric used by the Kennedy brothers and their backers. Liberals versus conservatives, but with exactly the same imperial line. So the stage was being set for the invasion of Cuba during the election campaign. And as has been described by others, I mean, the CIA guy who organized this Richard Bissell had also been involved in organizing the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, and the overthrow of Arbenz, a democratically elected government by the American empire, is not unlinked to the Cuban Revolution, because one of the central leaders of this revolution, Che Guevara, was in Guatemala in 1954, observing the coup with his own eyes and seeing what was taking place. So Che had absolutely nil illusions that the United States would try to do a similar thing anywhere else in Latin America where they felt that their interests or the interests of their multinational corporations, United Fruit in Guatemala, would be threatened. And this is the background in which the invasion was launched. And Bissell's first attempt was to send in guerrilla fighters and try and mimic the success of the Granma revolutionary, just to do what the Cuban revolutionaries had done, a handful of people. But what he didn't realize, because this is where the Americans find it difficult to admit, is that there was a lot of support for that guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra, in the cities of Cuba. This is underestimated, sometimes by the left as well, that large numbers of organized underground citizens, women in particular, and trade unionists working again in the urban underground, helped to create that revolution. So the CIA, thinking it could just repeat the pattern, forgot the people of Cuba, without whom that revolution from the mountains that came to the cities would not have been possible. And so they thought that would work. Then they realized that wasn't going to work, and they decided to embark on the Girón invasion in April 1961. And they hoped that sending in 1,500 or about 2,000 people would be enough. Well, once again, it was, as the ambassador has emphasized, it was not just the army and the police of Cuba. Of course, they were there, but there were workers' militias, farmers' militias. A farmers' militia was set up, consisting of several hundred farmers. And for 2 months before the actual invasion, they were trained by the revolutionary armed forces in how to use weapons, how to fight back, where to hit, where to strike, etc. So the Cubans were prepared. And then when the invasion took place, there was no big uprising. That was the other thing they were hoping. Have it as close to Havana as we possibly can, then we rush to Havana and there'll be an uprising of the people to greet us. But this was lunacy, bad strategy, and a complete ignorance of what had actually happened in Cuba during the revolution and why the revolution had taken place. That is why they went in there like this. That is why they were so confident that these people would sweep to victory quickly, or the CIA was, and when they asked Kennedy for air cover, he refused. Just a fact, historical fact. He realized that to give these guys air cover when they had basically been more or less captured was useless. And then began a bitter dispute inside the US administration. It was a huge victory for our side, of course. And it introduced Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution to the world. That's the first time. I was young, growing up in Pakistan at college. That's the first time we understood that there had been a huge, important revolution in Cuba and that our side had won. So that was after the Bay of Pigs. And so it's, and also for the rest of Latin America, South America, they realized this revolution was something new once a decision was made to declare that it was going to be a socialist revolution. And then after the defeat of the Americans at the Bay of Pigs, that became a fact as American companies were nationalized. All the properties of these Americans who had been exploiting the island for decades were taken away. The mafia was kicked out. Havana had been one of their big bases of operation, and they shifted to Florida. In large numbers. And so they resented this and they couldn't accept the fact that power had been taken away from them. So how to change the regime, how to defeat it, and normally the way they choose is occupy a tiny bit of territory, find a puppet president, recognize the puppet president. They're doing that in the Arab world today, have been trying to do it. They did it with Guaido in Venezuela, except that the Venezuelan army wouldn't play their game and it blew up in their face, the attempt to topple the Maduro regime. And they're trying it in parts of Africa, and the weaponry has changed, it's more sophisticated, but the actual method they use ideologically is the same. And that's why it always amazes me as to why so many people believe the rubbish they read when a war is taking place. I mean, in Afghanistan, they failed. They went in making all sorts of stupid promises. They couldn't defeat the largest force in the country. We may not agree with those people on most things, but they fought back. And the Americans, Biden is saying this has been the longest war in our history and we have to withdraw and we're going to withdraw in September. Excuse me, the longest war in your history has been the war against Cuba. Both sabotage, attempts to kill the president and revolutionary leaders of Cuba from the Bay of Pigs, before the Bay of Pigs, and now this war, economic war, which basically damages in large numbers or attempts to damage the population of Cuba, the people of Cuba. That they don't recognize, oh, we are for the people against the regime. That's nonsense. It never is the case. And the last thing, actually, which I think it's important to mention because it is not yet solved, this issue. The pressure after the failure of the Bay of Pigs on Kennedy to organize a proper US military intervention with US troops and air cover went on for some years. Don't forget that. And it was in order, and everyone knew this debate was taking place. And in my opinion, the evidence is now overwhelming that the reason Kennedy was assassinated by far-right elements, with money got from far-right elements in Florida, ultra-right-wing factions in the terrorist Central Intelligence Agency who felt humiliated, sections of the mafia who wanted their country back. And this president said, we're not doing that. We'll sanction them, we'll do this, we're not launch. And I think that's why he was punished. A movie has just come out, and not so long ago, called An American Affair, which is about the life of a woman. It's her story, a semi-feminist 60s radical, or late 50s radical, who was having an affair with Kennedy. And she used to speak with him. And the film reveals the pressure that was being put on him by the CIA. She herself, it's a true story, by the way. She herself was married to a senior CIA official who warned her, saying, stop interfering, because she said, you know, what's going on? The president is under, you people spend your time in our living room attacking him. And then she realized what was going on, and they killed her. They bumped her off. Her sister, who she told all this, was married to the editor, to Ben Bradley, a leading American journalist who knew this was going on and refused to write a single word about it. So the Bay of Pigs started with the landing in Cuba, but it ended up in Dallas a few years later. The American establishments turned on their own because he, for his own strategic reasons, did not favor a frontal assault on Cuba. And that, I think, is worth stressing. And what followed from that, of course, was Fidel had already met Nikita Khrushchev in the United Nations, I think in 1960, after, I think just after the Bay of Pigs, Fidel made his first trip to Moscow, and I had friends in Moscow who said to me that the reception given to Fidel Castro in Moscow, they said, we know what state-organized receptions look like, but and these were, you know, dissidents. But they said that for Fidel, large numbers of students and workers genuinely curious about this guy who was saying he'd made a socialist revolution in Cuba looked like, and that the welcome he got at the time, and during that Moscow trip was quite genuine. It wasn't fake, it wasn't just organized by the state. So that was how deep the Cuban Revolution went, and the fact that it's remained a beacon, and that a beacon is not a surprise. But that is also, it was the fear of another American invasion, a constant threat, if not by Kennedy, who was bumped off, maybe by some other president, forced the Cubans to sign a military pact with the Soviet Union. There was no other option, quite honestly, at that time. You know, I mean, it's foolish and idealistic to think there was some other option. Other options came later with the emergence of Chavismo and the changes in Bolivia with Evo Morales. That came many, many years later. I mean, I wish that had happened in the 70s. The isolation of Cuba would have been broken then, but we had to wait till the 1999 and then the early years of this century before that happened. So the deal with the Soviet Union was absolutely necessary. And I mean, people now say, oh, but it was a provocation to put nuclear missiles there. But hang on, was it? Because those nuclear missiles actually succeeded in defending Cuban sovereignty. It was the threat of military force which did it. Of course, foolish remarks were made by both sides. There's no doubt about that. But when it comes down to it, it was the stationing of nuclear missiles in Cuba, which finally compelled the United States to do a deal with the Russians and pledge that there would be no military attacks on Cuba as such, and remove the missiles they had set up in Turkey, pointing at the Soviet Union, NATO war missiles. So two good things came out of that. And then when the Russians withdrew, they withdrew. That was not a bad thing either, actually, to get the missiles out of there. But they did so after very firm agreements on these questions. So it was the Bay of Pigs, in that sense, turned out to be a historic event, a defeat that was needed to help shore up the Cuban Revolution, to help it spread, to popularize it, and to make it a permanent presence, fingers crossed, till now in the Latin America and South America, but not simply there, in the world as a large, where the model of the health service and education is used by people, progressive people, all over the world. One last point I will make. Many people have asked me, sometimes in interviews or when I'm doing seminars, etc., but names are changed. Do you think the Bay of Pigs should be given some other name? I said, no. And I said, what other name could they have called it? I said, the only name I would have approved of was the Bay of the Defeated Pigs. But it's not necessary to say that. People know that's what it was. Anyway, great to be with you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed for that contribution, Tariq. I really enjoyed the wide-ranging scope that you covered, and I thought that was a fascinating contribution. I just anecdotally, if I may, I remember one of my first encounters with Cuba was actually shortly after the revolution took place, when I saw on British television pictures of young people traveling on lorries and tanks and jeeps into Havana. And the commentator said, these young people have overthrown a dictator, and they've refused to get their hair cut until he's actually thrown out of office. That was the Barbudos, as they called them, the bearded ones who were part of the leadership of the revolution. And it made such an impression on me that here were people of principle who had a determination. They were young, they were people that you could identify with. And that memory and that, if you like, principles, a belief in the importance of political principle is something that stayed with me, all these years. Thank you very much indeed for that, Tariq. I've got some questions, Bárbara and Tariq, for both of you. First of all, to Bárbara, if I may, to the ambassador, from Adrian, who says, I visited Cuba a few years ago and was treated with respect. Could you say something about the situation in Cuba today with respect to housing and health? Obviously, that's a big topic. Maybe you just want to focus on health.
Yes. Well, as you know, the situation is very complex because of the pandemic as everywhere around the world. And this particular moment, we have a very complicated situation, especially in Havana, because of a new peak of contagious. But at the same time, we are continuing to work. We have, for example, we have been constructing more than 21 biomolecular lab in order to guarantee the number of PCR which is necessary to continue the protocol of Cuba. Our scientists and our science, Cuban science, has been a very, very important contribution, and in a hard condition, because I don't, it's not necessary for me to say anything about the blockade and the impact and the Trump measures against us in the middle of the pandemic. But despite all of these circumstances, we have are working, we have continuing. But this is a very difficult moment. At the same time, we are optimistic. We never surrounded, as we Cuban are. We are confident in our capability to advance despite all of these circumstances, and we are expecting that the final trial of vaccine candidates finish, and we need to apply them to immunize all of our population, because it's the only way to contribute to control the pandemic. A very recent research has reported that the South African and Kent strains are circulating in Cuba right now, as you know, are very, very faster to spread the contagious, and at the same time, the mortality is higher. That's what I think. I don't know, Bernard, if you have any other question, please?
Yes, I've got a question for Tariq now from Sultan, who asks, do you think President Biden will make any changes with regard to Cuba, Venezuela, and Latin America? And do you see anything happening as a result of him coming to office? Tariq?
No, I don't. It doesn't look like it. We can be hopeful for surprises, but I doubt it. I mean, effectively, whoever becomes president of the United States, whether it's Obama or Biden or Trump or Clinton or Bush, they are presidents of an imperial country, an imperial state. And this imperial state is not run all the time by the Congress or the Senate or the Supreme Court. The military plays a very important role in the institutions of the state, on the National Security Council, the Pentagon as Defense Intelligence Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency are in and out of the White House. So a president who decides to make a sharp shift, it can be done, I'm not saying it can be done, would have to be very brave and courageous indeed. I mean, the Kennedy example is not just an idle threat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Raul said during his presidency that Cuba was willing to have dialogue with the United States of America on the basis of respect for the sovereignty of Cuba. And that, I'm sure, still remains the case. But of course, under Trump for the last 4 years, we've seen an extremely vindictive policy. It's interesting, in fact, Biden has appointed a man called Juan Gonzalez, I think, as one of his experts on Latin America. And I was reading up on what he was an advisor to Obama. What he said in 2017 was about Obama's policy. The Obama doctrine in Cuba could be summarized as a policy of subversion by engagement.
Yeah.
So quite clearly, it's a change in tactics, but not a change in strategy. And of course, if I may say, I think the acid test for a real substantive change in US policy, of course, is going to be the evacuation of Guantanamo, getting off Cuban soil. I think that would be a real indicator of a step forward.
I wish that they could, there was an interview with Fidel I saw a number of years ago, an old interview in which the interviewer said to him, why didn't you get rid of Guantanamo at the same time as this deal was being done with the Americans on the removal of the missiles? And Fidel said, you're absolutely right. We thought about that afterwards. We were so engaged in the central negotiations of getting what we wanted. But he said, with hindsight, we should have put Guantanamo in the bag, so to get rid of it forever. And now they go, the symbolism of using a US military base in Cuba to carry out their disgusting tortures. And it's just sort of beggars the imagination.
Bárbara, do you want to make any comment about President Biden and Cuba's view on the change, whether there will be any, you anticipate any significant variations in policy, changes in policy?
I can't anticipate nothing about it. I think that I only want to remember that from the beginning and around all of these 60 years, the Cuban position is the same. We have in the capability to discuss any differences in equal conditions with the United States, and we think, despite our differences, which there are and always be there, we can be a normal relations, not good, but normal relations, bilateral relations with the United States. Even at this moment, we have bilateral relations, but at the same time, the Trump administration act through Cuba as an enemy country. And what we are in this disposition and this capability, but we need to, I think, no one are sure what will happen right now. There is no, and of course, I don't like to speculate about all of this item, which is very sensitive for everyone.
Thank you. Before we close, I'm going to invite Tariq and the ambassador to come back, but I just want to give a reminder to everybody to consider joining the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, to becoming members of it and becoming active in the campaign. We've mentioned various initiatives that we're involved with, like encouraging members of parliament to sign the early day motion, calling on the British government to not comply with the terms of the blockade. And that is a real matter, because here in Britain, we have seen banks obstructing funds being sent from Britain to Cuba. We've seen a student who was applying to the Open University having his candidature to study for a PhD with the Open University blocked by British administrations and British institutions. So this whole question of the way the blockade works, it has this extraterritorial dimension, which is relevant in terms of Britain as well. So please join the Cuba Solidarity Campaign and become active in it. Contact your member of parliament. And if you are able to, we very much welcome any donations you're able to give. Obviously, during this period of the pandemic, it's not been possible for us to organize our usual initiatives of campaigns and meetings and events. So we very much would welcome contributions if you're able to do that. Normally, we'd be talking about delegations that are going to Cuba from trade unionists, from young trade unionists, from educators and from other people, and literally hundreds of people going over in solidarity, but also to enjoy the opportunity to see Cuba, to meet with Cubans firsthand, and to hear from them their views and their thoughts about the revolution and what it means to them. So please become engaged with the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. I'm going to invite Bárbara, and then I'll invite Tariq if you would like to make some concluding remarks. Ambassador? It seems like we've lost the sound, so I'm sorry.
Sorry.
You're back.
I think Bárbara was looking forward to supper and you've interrupted her.
No, because I was sending a message for everyone. I recommend that please watching the statement of our president, Díaz-Canel, yesterday about Cuban, US-Cuban relations in the Andorra summit. Okay. I'm sorry, excuse me, it was awful.
No, it's all right. These things happen. It just shows that we're live. Tariq, would you like to make one thing just to throw in, if I may, Tariq, while you're considering a few words. Somebody asked, what did you think about Bernie Sanders in terms of what was his attitude to Cuba?
Well, obviously, Bernie's attitude towards Cuba was much better. On a number of occasions, he made very positive remarks on the sanctions. But who knows? Because, you know, when whoever from the Democrats gets elected, immediately, whatever their positions, comes under very heavy pressure. If you look at AOC, this striking, very passionate woman who was elected as a Democrat, initially very radical, but now she is totally on board. I've not heard her. I hope I'm wrong. I've never heard her say sanctions should be lifted. And she certainly supports even the old Trump line on Venezuela. So you get the feeling that she and others like her are immediately being groomed for better and maybe bigger things, just like Obama was. And in order to accomplish that and build their careers, they have to stick with the imperial establishment, which is very strong and powerful in the United States. On Britain, it should be said that in the past, both Conservative and Labour governments defied the embargo. You know, they traded with the Cubans. I mean, there's an old story of secondhand buses, London buses being transported and sold to Cuba at cheaper prices. But we are now in a situation where this particular government, and I assume Starmer and his gang, are so closely linked to the United States that they will find it very difficult to criticize it in public. We should certainly put pressure on them. And this is what we lost when we lost Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, and the whole switch to the right in the Labour Party. It's back to business as usual now. And a handful of members of parliament, you know, a few good ones, will carry on raising the issue as before, as will Jeremy as an independent, which he technically is, even though he doesn't like hearing that. But anyway. So it was very good to discuss all this and support and solidarity with Cuba against its enemies, both within the continent and in the United States. I mean, this is an issue now which is so much related to the millionaires and billionaires and, you know, who's advanced by selling drugs and now run huge empires, industrial empires in the United States, and are linked to both parties. That's an aspect which we shouldn't forget.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Her Excellency, the Ambassador, for your contribution and your part in this evening's events. Thank you very much, as always, Tariq, to you, comrade. Good to see you. And our profound thanks to Victor Dreke. For me, it was always a very engaging, very humbling experience to listen to a comrade who's played such an important and critical role in the revolution in Cuba, and who remains as an inspiration to all of us to continue the struggle and continue the fight. Once again, to those of you who are perhaps not yet members of the campaign, please do join. Follow us on social media, follow our webpage, and keep in touch, and let's build a solidarity with Cuba. Thank you very, very much to all of our contributors, all of our speakers, to the Ambassador and to Tariq and to Victor. Thank you very much.
Compañeros poetas, tomando en cuenta los últimos sucesos, en la poesía quisiera preguntar, me urge, ¿qué tipo de adjetivos se deben usar para hacer el poema de un barco sin que se haga sentimental? Fuera de la vanguardia o evidente panfleto, si debo usar palabras como flota cubana de pesca y Playa Giron. compañeros de música, tomando en cuenta esas politonales y audaces canciones, quisiera preguntar, me urge, ¿qué tipo de armonía se debe usar para hacer la canción de este barco con hombres de poca niñez? Hombres y solamente hombres sobre cubierta, hombres negros y rojos y azules, los hombres que pueblan el Playa Giron. Compañeros de historia, tomando en cuenta lo implacable que debe ser la verdad, quisiera preguntar, me urge tanto, ¿qué debiera decir? ¿Qué fronteras debo respetar? Si alguien roba comida y después da la vida, ¿qué hacer? ¿Hasta dónde debemos practicar las verdades? ¿Hasta dónde sabemos que escriban pues la historia su